Indicting God, Jeremiah 2 verse 5. Thus saith the Lord, what iniquity have your fathers found in me, that they are gone far from me, and have walked after vanity, and have become vain? The words are a solemn reproof of the Jerusalem or the Jewish church in the form of an expostulation concerning which may be observed. 1. The behaviour of that church, concerning which God expostulates, namely their departing from him to go after vanity. They were gone far from him, and had walked after vanity, and were become vain. The same behaviour is expressed in other words in the 13th verse. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. We are told what that vanity was, or what those vain things were, that they went after in the context, namely their idols, as the 8th verse, the priest said not, where is the Lord? 2. We may observe the expostulation or challenge itself. What iniquity their fathers had found in him, that should be a reason of their thus departing from him to go after vanity. It is said, what iniquity have your fathers found in me? Because this apostasy of the Israelitish church, about which God is expostulating with them, was now of long standing. They had for some generations before Jeremiah prophesied, in a great measure forsaken God to go after idols, and the present generation did but follow their fathers in it. Their fathers first apostatized, and therefore God asks what iniquities their father had found in him. The manner of expression here carries in it several things. 1. It implies that in departing from God to go after vanity, they acted as though they had found some iniquity in God. For, as is observed in the foregoing verses, Israel in their first times followed God and cleaved to him. They had taken God for their covenant God, and seemed to manifest a very high esteem of him, to choose him for their portion and heritage, and to devote themselves entirely to him. I remember thee, the kindness of thy youth, the love of thine espousals, when thou wentest after me in the wilderness, in a land that was not sown. Israel was holiness unto the Lord, and the firstfruits of his increase. All that devour him shall offend. Evil shall come upon them, saith the Lord. Verses 2-3. They seemed with great affection and engagedness of heart to devote themselves to him, and to bind themselves by a firm covenant to be his people. But now it was far otherwise. They were now grown out of conceit of him. They showed by their practice that they did not like him, and therefore left him for the sake of others. They preferred very mean things. This carried in it a very reflection on God, as though he had not been faithful and true to his covenant that he entered into at first with them. If this was not the reason of their departing from God as they had done, there could be no justifiable show of reason for it, for they were God's covenant people. They had firmly obliged themselves to God in covenant, and unless God broke covenant with them, there could be no excuse for their departing from him. They had forsaken that God that was known by all the nations around them to have been formerly the God of their nation, would have this look in the eyes of the other nations, that the people of Israel had got out of conceit of their God. Upon the experience and trial they had had of him, they did not find him as they expected. He did not do for them according to what he had encouraged them, and therefore now they liked other gods far better, and it would have had such a look in their eyes the more for it being so unusual a thing, and not known in the world for many ages, that a nation should change their gods, as they are told. The 10th and 11th verses. For pass over the isles of Chittim, and see, and send unto Kedar, and consider diligently, and see if there be such a thing. Have a nation changed their gods, which are yet no gods? But my people have changed their glory for that which doth not profit. For the Israelites only to forsake the God that they formerly worshipped and prized, and seemed to value themselves upon, when all of the nations kept to their God, seemed to hold forth to the eye of the world, as though they had found something very bad in their God. what was just cause their great dislike more than any other nation had found in any of the gods that they worshipped. 2. It implies that they had really found no iniquity in God, for God challenges them to mention any iniquity that their fathers had found in him. Such an interrogation implies a strong negation. 3. It implies or shows the unreasonableness of such a behaviour in them. This challenge don't only carry in it a strong negation, but severe reproof. It implies that there can be no reason or excuse given for them why they should do as they had done. Doctrine: when a covenant people that have formerly seemed to cleave to God and manifest an high esteem of him do afterward depart from him, it carries in it a reflection on God, as though they had found some iniquity in him. In speaking to this doctrine, I would first speak something briefly of the qualifications and circumstances of a people therein mentioned. Second, the behaviour of such a people that is spoken of in it. Third, would show that such a behaviour in such a people carries in it a reflection on God, as though they had found some iniquity in him. 1. I would speak something briefly of the qualifications and circumstances of such a people spoken of in the doctrine. These consist in 3 things. First, that they be a covenant people. The people spoken of are not a people that have been born and bred up in heathenism, but a people that have enjoyed the light of God's word, whereby the true God has been declared and made known to them. And they are a people that have professed to believe this God to be the true God, and have professed to receive him as their God. They are a people that have been the visible worshippers of this God, a people that have in profession accepted the covenant offers that God has made, that have laid hold on his covenant, and have on their part obliged themselves in covenant to him to be his people, to worship him and be in subjection to him, and cleave to him as their God. Second, they have formerly seemed to cleave to God, and for a while seemed to keep covenant with him. Third, the people spoken of are a people that heretofore manifested an high esteem of God. There is such an appearance in a people's entering into covenant with God, and professing to receive him as their God, and covenanting to worship this God, and in cleaving to him as God. For anyone to receive any being as God is to receive him as the object of his highest esteem. He that professes to have respect to the true God, as God professes to have respect to him, is worthy of all possible honour and regard. Micah, a worshipper of images, said, Judges 18 verse 24, Ye have taken away my gods, and what have I more? In worshipping any being as God, there is a manifestation or profession of superlative esteem, for the notion of divine worship carries in it supreme respect, or is showing that esteem and paying that respect and honour which is above all that is due to mere creatures. But sometimes a professing or covenanting people do in a special manner make a show of a very high esteem of God. They may do it in words by speaking very much and very highly of God, by expressing an high esteem of him, by speaking much of the sense they have of his glory and excellency. Or they may do it in the show they make of extraordinary esteem in the externals of worship, either by their abounding very much in outward duties of worship, being very much in prayer and praise and hearing the word, or by their seeming affection and engagedness of heart in duties. Or they may do in their practice, by appearing ready to do for God, and to undergo great difficulties for his sake, which is the way spoken of in the context, that the people of Israel had formerly manifested an extraordinary esteem of God, and a strong and dear love to him, like the love of espousals, or the affection of a bride to the bridegroom on the marriage days. They went after God in the wilderness, a land that was not sown. Verse 2. This has not respect to that generation that went out of Egypt, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness, that were very corrupt and froward, but the generation of their children spoken of. Numbers 14 verse 31. But your little ones, which ye said should be a prey, them will I bring in, and they shall know the land which ye have despised. So Deuteronomy 1 verse 39, the same generation that entered into the land of Canaan with Joshua, and took possession of the good land. And the going after God in the wilderness here spoken of is not the going of the children of Israel out of Egypt into the wilderness of Sinai, but their following God through the dreadful wilderness that the congregation long wandered in after they went back from Kadesh Barnea, which is spoken of Deuteronomy 8 verse 15. Who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions, and drought, where there was no water? Although this generation had a much greater trial than the generation of their fathers had before they came to Kadesh Barnea, yet they never murmured against God in any wise as their fathers had done. But their trials had a contrary effect upon them, namely to humble them and fit them for great mercy. Deuteronomy 8 verses 2 to 3. And thou shalt remember the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness to humble thee, and to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldst keep his commandments or no. And he humbled thee, and suffered thee to hunger, and fed thee with manna, which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know that man doth not live by bread only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live. And verse 16, who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness, to humble and so prove thee, and to do thee good at the latter end. And therefore God says, Hosea 13 verse 5, I did know thee in the wilderness, in the land of great drought. This generation were eminent for piety, as appears by many things said of them in the book of Numbers, and especially Joshua. Though there were many wicked men amongst them, they were not like their fathers, an unbelieving generation, but believed God and followed him, and by faith overcame Sihon and Og, and the giants and mighty nations of Canaan. They showed a laudable, fervent zeal for God on several occasions, as on the occasion of Achan's sin, but especially when they suspected the two tribes, and half had set up an altar in opposition to the altar of burnt offerings before the tabernacle. And we are told that Israel feared and served the Lord all the days. The men of that generation lived, though that after them arose a generation that knew not the Lord. Joshua 24 verse 31, Judges 2 verse 7, verse 10. See also the 12th verse. And this is the love of their espousals that God speaks of, that he remembered that they had so much departed from. 2. The second thing in the doctrine to be considered is the behaviour of such a people spoken of in it, namely their departing from God, which begins by their losing that esteem they seem to have and that affection they seem to exercise towards him. A people may be said to depart from the Lord when they grow cold and indifferent about the things of God, when they are dull in his service. This is attended with the going out of their hearts after other things, or their going after vanity, as it was in Israel. They walked after vanity and became vain. When a covenant people depart from the true God, they evermore go after idols. They give that respect to other gods that they remove from God. For every man will have his God, or gods. Every man and every people will have something that they deify, or give their highest regard to, so that every professing people that go far from God do go after idols, as well as the children of Israel. Though they don't go after Baals and images of wood and stone, as they did, yet there are other things as mean as they that do as truly make gods of, as the children of Israel did of Baal. And when the true God is departed from, the consequence is that there are many gods come in his room. Some set up mammon for their God and deify worldly profits. Colossians 3 verse 5. Covetousness is idolatry. There will be many among such a people whose hearts, being grown cold towards the true God, will be violently engaged after worldly gain. It is commonly thus, especially with the elder persons and heads of families amongst a degenerate people. And in such a time of departure from God, the young people will also have other gods. Though formerly religion seemed to be lively among young persons, and many of them were awakened and hopefully converted, and seemed to be full of religious affections, yet now they are become cold and heartless in religion, and negligent of God, and they make gods of youthful pleasures, of gay clothing, of their company diversions and vain mirth. All sorts have their idols that they serve in their hearts, their affections and thoughts, and that they are paying their devotions to in private, and that they honour in their thought, and that they honour in their talk, talking of those things that their hearts are upon, but leaving the true God, and things appertaining to him, out of their discourse. And commonly every family have their gods as of old. They were wont to have their household gods, as Laban had his family gods that Rachel stole, when she fled with Jacob her husband, Genesis 31 verse 30, and as Micah did, which the children of Dan stole. This departing from God to idols appears commonly amongst the people, by many ill things and iniquities breaking in particular sinful acts in particular persons, and in various unsuitable and becoming things done in public concerns, and in the creeping in of diverse ill practices and customs. I come now in the third place, 3, to show that when such a people do thus depart from God, it carries in it a reflection on God, as though they had found some iniquity in him. This is the language of it. It seems to hold this forth. There are 2 ways that one may cast a reflection on another. One is by speaking evil of him and reproaching of him in words, by charging of him with that which is dishonourable, and saying that he is mean and contemptible or wicked and hateful, or saying those things that imply it. Another is the doing of it in practice, or carrying towards him, as if he were such an one. Thus, if one man, in a course of actions, treats another man with contempt, with such a behaviour as men are wont to treat those with that they account very despicable, he that is thus treated, and others that are spectators, will look upon this as equivalent to his saying in words that he looks upon him as a mean and contemptible person. So if he, in behaviour towards him, shows that he does not trust him, don't put his trust in his words, and treats him with high resentment and indignation, this is as real a reflection upon him as if he in words said that he was an unworthy, false and wicked person. So when a covenant people that have formerly manifested an high esteem of God do depart from God, they do really cast this reflection on God, that they have found some iniquity in him, though they don't speak in words, which will appear by the following things. First, there can be no other good and just reason of their departing from God. Such a people are under far greater obligations to cleave to God than others. For besides the natural obligations that all mankind are under from God's glorious perfections and their relation to him as his creatures, such a people are under covenant obligation. They oblige themselves in strict promises and solemn vows that they will cleave to him. There has been a mutual covenant between God and them, wherein God has obliged himself by promises on his part to be their God, and to take care of them, and to do such and such great things for them on condition of their adherence to him. He is obliged by his faithfulness and truth and justice to them. And they have solemnly obliged themselves to him to be constant in his service, and not to depart from him. And therefore there is nothing can justify their departing from him, but their finding some unexpected iniquity in him. There is nothing can dissolve their obligation on their part, but only his breach of covenant on his part. If God had been just and faithful in his dealings with them, or agreeable to his covenant, then they are false, deceitful, and treacherous in their dealings with him. So that when a people depart from God, and continue in their departure, it must be a reflection on God, as though they had found some iniquity in him. For it is either a reflection on God, as having found iniquity in him, or a reproach of them as being guilty of a vile falseness and faithfulness towards God. For there is no medium in such a case. Either there is iniquity in God or in them. If there be a departing from God after covenanting with him, there is a breach of covenant, and wherever there is a breach of covenant, it lies between the parties covenanting. Either God has broken covenant, or they are guilty of a most vile breach of covenant themselves. But a people that have departed from God and continue in their departure don't condemn themselves as being the guilty party, but they justify themselves by their practice. If they practically condemned themselves, they would repent and humble themselves and turn to God from their departure and continue in it no longer. There is no practical condemning themselves in such a case but this. A man never can be said practically to condemn any practice in himself as long as he continues in the practice. A continuing still in the practice is the practical justifying of it, so that a people that continue in their departure from God, don't practically reflect on themselves as the guilty party, but the language of their practice is that they do well in what they do. They do well in departing from God, and therefore of consequence it must be the language of their practice that 'tis God that is guilty of iniquity. And they do cast a vile reflection on him, as though they had found some injustice and falseness in him. Their continuing still in their departure from God is as much as to say 'tis not that they are to blame, but God. Second, an alteration in men's practices is wont to follow a proportional able alteration in their thoughts and judgments of things. It is so in men's common affairs. When men one while are engaged in one thing, and then after a while are off from that and get engaged in another, 'tis because they alter their minds, they form new judgments of things. When they at one time pursue one business or employment, and then leave that off, and betake themselves to another, at one time they are of one way of living, and then leave that and get into a quite different way. One while are great companions of such a sort of person, and then forsake them and cleave to others. Others that stand by are wont to say that he has changed his mind concerning such employments, practices, or companies. He has found something that has made him think otherwise of them, of what he formerly pursued, than he used to do. The will, and so the practice, follows the dictates of the practical understanding. And therefore, when a covenant people do very much alter in their behaviour towards God, in that whereas formerly they seemed to give up themselves in covenant to him, and were greatly engaged in his worship and service, and then afterwards depart from him, it seems to hold forth to the world that they have some cause to alter their thoughts of God. Their former practice seems to hold that forth, that they thought him to be an holy, just, and faithful God, and therefore they manifested an high esteem of him as such. Their visibly accepting God as their covenant God, and giving up themselves in covenant to him, had this language in it in the eye of the world, that they were so confident of God's faithfulness, that they were not afraid to venture upon it, as it were to strike hands with him, and depend on his covenant promises. Otherwise, why did they engage themselves in covenant with him? But now the alteration of their practice seems to hold forth an alteration of their mind with respect to this matter, as not esteeming God faithfully as they before seemed to do, as if they were disappointed and had found him otherwise than they thought. Third, this alteration in their behaviour towards God has this appearance the more because it is after some trial of God in a covenant relation. In entering into covenant with God to receive him as their God, they seem to manifest an high esteem of God, and particularly an high esteem of him with respect to his faithfulness, as though they had so great an esteem of his fidelity that they were not afraid to venture their all upon it, and in confidence in it, wholly to devote and give up themselves to this God, as they visibly do in entering into covenant with him. But now, after they have continued in this covenant relation to God for some time, and have had some trial of him, they depart from him, and practically declare that they are unwilling to trust to his fidelity any longer. Now, what can be the language of this under these circumstances, but that they have found him unfaithful, that they are woefully disappointed they haven't found God as they expected and as God promised. They, in entering into covenant, acted as though they thought God the best of beings, but now, after there's been some kind of trial, they leave him and go after others, as though they now were of another mind, and thought others preferable to him, which is as much as to say to the world that God don't prove according to what they heard, and heretofore thought of him. When a covenant people that are formerly manifested in high esteem forsake God, it could be for no other reason but some dislike, and this dislike, appearing after a time of trial and experience, seems to show as though they had found unexpected evil in God. As to what they hear of God, that is the same that is used to be. The word of God declares just the same of God at one time as it does at another. The Holy Scripture speaks the same things now that it did before, and they have nothing now to help them or to form a judgment of God more than before, but only the time of trial and experience they have had. Therefore their altering their judgment after this trial carries this reflection in it, that they have found iniquity in God. If they on trial have found no iniquity in God, they are inconsistent with themselves, for their becoming a covenant people as they did, declared that they did esteem God a most glorious, excellent, and faithful being. Unless they upon trial found otherwise, why do they in their practice say otherwise now? When the first person of all mankind that ever departed from God did depart from him, namely our mother Eve, it was because she thought she had found iniquity and falseness in God. God had told her and her husband that if she eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, she would surely die. But the serpent made her believe that God was false in this, and that God said this contrary to his own knowledge, that he made them believe that in the day that they eat of the tree they should surely die, to affright them from eating such excellent fruit that he thought too good for them, and begrudged them the happiness of such a repast, and of the happy consequences of it, when at the same time he knew that the consequences would not be any calamity at all to them, but on the contrary great happiness, that it now make them even like gods, knowing good and evil. They should know more than now they did, and should so increase in knowledge that they should be like to God himself. And God begrudged them such happiness, and was not willing that they should be like himself, but had a mind to keep them under, and that made him go to deter them with a false threatening from eating. Ye shall not surely die, says the serpent, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. The serpent made use of the name that the tree had, namely the tree of knowledge of good and evil, as in argument of it, and probably made use of his own pretended experience as an evidence of it, pretending that he that before was a poor, irrational, dumb creature had eaten of this fruit, and it had at once given him the faculty of reason and speech, which he saw he now exercised, and so argued, that if it would make such an alteration in a beast as to make them rational and wise as man, if man eat of it, it could do no less than turn them from men into gods. This prevailed on Eve to think that it was so indeed. Thus the first of all mankind that departed from God for the sake of vanity did so because she thought she had found iniquity in God. And when any of her posterity do in like manner depart from God, it carries in the like vile reflections on God with those that the devil cast on him in his temptation of Eve, namely that God dealt falsely in his covenant. Application. I would now apply this doctrine first to the case of this land, and second to the case of this town. And in the first place, let us consider how the doctrine is applicable to the case of this land. And in doing this, I would first show how that which is spoken of as the circumstances and behaviour of a people in the doctrine is the case of the people of this land, and second show how unreasonably we have thereby cast a reflection on God, as though we had found iniquity in him. First, I would show how that which is spoken of in the doctrine is the case of this land. 1. We are a covenant people. Every professing people is so, but we are so in a special manner, for God has dealt with the people of this land in many respects, much as he did with the children of Israel when he entered into covenant with them. He has brought us out and separated us from other people, among whom we were under a heavy yoke of bondage, and has brought us away over a vast ocean, as he led the people of Israel through a great wilderness, and has brought us to a great distance, that we might be a peculiar people to himself. He has given us a good land for our possession, and to that end has taken away the land from its former inhabitants to give it to us, that we might possess it. He in a remarkable manner has cast out the heathen before us, and here has planted us and settled us, and has as it were set his tabernacle in the midst of us. He has given the free and full enjoyment of his word in ordinances, which before in our bondage, in the land from whence we came, we were denied. And here God has entered into covenant with us. Our forefathers, on their first coming and settling here, did solemnly enter into covenant with God, and were often renewing their covenant. There is probably no more people in the world whose case is the manner of our becoming a distinct covenant people, is so parallel with that of the Church of Israel as this people. God's providences towards this land in the first setting of it were, as it were, its solemn espousals to Christ. 2. The people of this land, in their first times, cleaved to God, and manifested in high esteem of him. Our forefathers manifested in high esteem of God, as the children of Israel did, by going after him into a wilderness, a land that was not sown. They had such a value for the pure worship and ordinances of God, that they were willing, for the sake of them, to leave their own country and all the pleasant things of it, to go over a vast ocean, running the venture of the difficulties and dangers of the seas, to go to a land 3,000 miles distant, a land that was wild and barbarous, where they could expect no other than to suffer innumerable hardships and difficulties that had till then been unexperienced by them, and many dangers from the barbarous natives, as it came to pass. And those times, though they were times of the land's greatest difficulties and trials, yet were the times of its greatest purity. Then the land in general was pure in the doctrines professed in it. They generally, in all parts, believed the same doctrines. They were of one mind and one judgment, and spoke the same things. And then also the land in general was pure in its worship, mostly free from human inventions and ceremonies. Then it was a general thing in the land that great account was made of vital and experimental religion. There was much talk in those days through the land in general of the work of conversion, of the way of the influences of the Holy Spirit of God on the hearts of sinners, in bringing them home to himself, and on the saints in establishing and building them up and comforting them. Then such subjects as these were much the subject of conversation, and they used then also to be very much the subject of preaching. Such things were much insisted on by the ministry of the land in general. Discourses that most nearly concerned the life and power of religion were to be heard from the pulpits in all the meeting houses all over the land. Go where you would, you might hear such subjects unfolded. And then there was much of the work of God going forward, not only in one particular corner of the country, but in many places. It was a thing commonly then to be heard in one town and another, that such an one was under awakenings. Such an one was hopefully converted and brought home to Christ. There was then in the land much of a spirit of devotion, a spirit of prayer, a spirit to prize ordinances, and many of the churches in the land were furnished with ministers that were eminently fervent in their work. And then also civil rulers, many of them were men that distinguished themselves by a zeal for religion and against vice and immorality. They were men that were not ashamed of religion, but looked upon their honour, and as they were set at the head of public affairs, so they were forward and leading persons in religion. And then a spirit of love prevailed amongst Christians. And though there were then, as there are in the purest times, found many things amiss, though the land was not free of vice of immorality, yet many of those vicious practices that now are grown common, and that men are bold and barefaced in, were then looked upon as very shameful and ignominious. If anyone fell into the sin of fornication, or some other foul transgression, it was lamented by all their relations and others, and it was the general thought that something very sorrowful had happened. This was the love of our espousals, when we were holiness to the Lord, and the first fruits of his increase. But 3, we have now greatly departed from God, and are gone far from him. The land in great measure is departed from that purity in its principles and doctrines, and there appears in multitudes a great hankering after Arminian doctrines, which are such principles as do exceedingly tend to eat out the heart and destroy the life of religion. The sacred order, the ministry in the country, is much infected with these principles, as is too notorious to be denied, and the public schools of learning, the nurseries whence the churches throughout the land are supplied with teachers, are considerably tainted with them, so that this disease is seated much in the head, and infects those that are set to be lights and guides to others, and have the place of the eye in the body. And how great our calamity in such a case is, we may learn from that saying of Christ, Matthew 6:22-23, the light of the body is the eye. And the contrary truths, which are those doctrines of Christianity that do especially concern the power of religion, are very much neglected. There are multitudes of the pulpits in the country from whence there is nothing of them to be heard. Many are those that don't expressly deny them, yet seem to look upon them of no great importance, and that 'tis best to leave them alone. and not to meddle with them in the pulpit, as if the public preaching of them would be an hurtful tendency. And the work of conversion and experimental piety is very much neglected in the ministry in most of the pulpits, insomuch that things of this nature are grown to be strange things, and any talk of them seems strange and unintelligible to great parts of the land. What is chiefly insisted on in most pulpits is morality and things that appertain to natural religion, neglecting those things by which that glorious gospel is chiefly distinguished from heathen philosophy. And of late also there has appeared a great hankering after ceremonies of human invention in the word of God. Men growing weary of the pure worship of God, as he left it by his own institution, they must needs go about to mend it by their own adorning. They dislike the altar of whole stones as God has formed, and therefore lift up their own tools upon it to pollute it. And there has been for a long time but very little appearance of a work of conversion being carried out in the bigger part of the land. In most places nothing is said or heard about it, either in public or private, and such things are grown exceeding strange, and religion is become in most places nothing but a mere form, just to keep an old custom of going to meeting and the like, when there is notorious appearance of an exceeding coldness and deadness towards God and Christ and heavenly things, and a great neglect of them, while men's hearts are all engaged on the world. And innumerable vicious practices have overspread the country in most parts of it, as drunkenness, profane swearing, lasciviousness, huckling, chatting, and all manner of debauchery. Now in many towns in the country, profane oaths and curses are common things daily heard in the taverns, streets, and in private companies. Whereas in the first times of the country, if a man had been heard to swear a profane oath, great notice would have been taken of it as a dreadful thing, and horrid and strange piece of wickedness that had appeared. And the land has long been exceeding overspread with the spirit of contention and strife, both in civil and ecclesiastical matters. And the spirit of love that formerly prevailed in the country has in a great measure ceased, and we have for a long time been gradually growing more and more corrupt. Our days of fasting have been a mere mockery. We continue still, we justify ourselves in it. Thus have we in this land heretofore cast a reflection on God as though we had found some iniquity in him, and thus we do still. But let us now, in the second place, consider how unreasonably we cast this reflection upon God. For as it was said to the children of Israel, so it may be said unto us, What iniquity have you found in God, that you are gone far away? There has been a mutual covenant between God and this land, wherein both have been obliged in mutual engagements. Wherein has God failed on his part? In what respect has he been unjust or unfaithful to us? Wherein has he broken covenant with us, that we have departed from him, and have so broke the yoke and burst the bonds? What is that God has done towards us, that should put us out of conceit of him, that we should not cleave to him, and manifest as high an esteem of him now as heretofore? Wherein has God been hard in his dealings with the land? If we consider God's dealings with the land, we have no cause to complain, but must say that God has been very faithful and very good and gracious to us from our first beginnings to this time. As God said of Israel, I have not been a wilderness to Israel, Jeremiah 2 verse 31. So may he say of us, God was very good to us in our first times, and by a series of many remarkable and wonderful providences protected and defended the land against the Indian natives that then surrounded them, and vastly exceeded them in number, though God had before greatly diminished them to make way. This in some measure may be applied to us. Psalm 105 verse 11. When they were few in number and strangers, he protected us from enemies to our civil and religious privileges, gave us great liberty and great privileges, and continued them to us. And though the land was long afflicted with wars with the Indians and suffered many great calamities, yet God has caused them gradually to decrease and dwindle. The land gradually emptied of them, and this saw calamity more and more removed. God has removed them to make room for us, taken them away by a strong hand of heaven against them, and by a secret blast, that we might possess their land and enjoy it peaceably. And so God hath done, till now at length he has given us the whole land for our possession. And now of a long time we have been free from the calamities of war with the Indians, and long enjoyed the great blessings of peace, and have set down everyone under his own vine and under his fig tree, and slept in quiet, and have gone to and fro without fear of the sword of the wilderness, and have not got our bread with the peril of our lives. And that, though we have dealt very unfaithfully with God in our behaviour towards them, it was part of our pretence and covenant when we came into the land that was not sown to instruct the Indians. This, our pretended design, was very little done in comparison of what ought to have been done for them. Instead of Christianizing them, we have debauched them with strong drink. Instead of communicating the glorious gospel that their souls might be saved, we have given them that which was poison to both their souls and bodies, and continue still so to do. God might justly have punished us long ago for this, by causing them to grow and increase upon us, and wax stronger and stronger, to extirpate us. But yet so has God's mercy triumphed, that we have been free from the calamities of war, and long enjoyed the great blessings of peace. We have long been grown worse and worse, and have greatly abused the great and distinguishing mercies God bestowed upon us. But yet so wonderful is God's goodness and long-suffering caused to grow, that we have become a great people, and have increased greatly in wealth and comfortableness of our outward circumstances. Though God has afflicted us, it has been far less than our iniquity to him. God has been very gentle. He has continued our religious privileges and civils so far, that we are distinguished from most people on the face of the earth for our zeal for religion. We have deserved long ago to have been utterly destroyed. We have been very obstinate. We often have mocked God with pretences of humiliation and repentance. We have deserved to have all our privileges taken away. And God hath of late poured out his Spirit wonderfully on this so degenerate and provoking a people. Thus has God not only been just and faithful in his dealings with us, but abundantly good and gracious. So far have we been from finding any iniquity in God. How aggravated, therefore, is our behaviour towards him in casting so vile a reflection on God. I come now, too, to apply this doctrine to the case of this town, with respect to our declension from what was visible in us 3 years ago. At that time there was a great appearance and manifestation of a very high esteem of God. I need not particularly mention in how many ways. It was so lately that it cannot be forgotten, and 'tis also notorious, and what can't be hid, how greatly we have departed from God. The doctrine shows us what is the language of our thus departing from God, namely that we have found some iniquity in God. Indeed, in the last season of the pouring out of God's Spirit, we thought well of God, but we act as if upon further trial of him, we do not think of him as we did. We did take him to be a holy God, a faithful friend, and were then so confident of it, that we were not afraid to venture upon it to accept him as our covenant God, and visibly to give up ourselves wholly to him. But we, having had considerable time of trial, now cast a reflection on him in our practice, as though we had seen cause to alter our minds about him, as though we had trusted in him, but he had failed us. He had not made good his word, and we had leaned on a broken staff. And now we see our error in forsaking the enjoyments of this world for God, and as if we repented of our bargain, choose to return to our old masters again. Here let several things be considered. First, how vile this reflection is that we cast on God by our backsliding. To reflect on God as weak would be very heinous, but to reflect on him as wicked is more heinous. When a covenant people departs from God, it has an appearance as though they esteemed injurious, false and treacherous one that breaks covenant, one that is not to be depended upon, one that there is no trust to, and one that we have on trial proved to be such an one. 'Tis one thing by which the apostle sets forth the dreadful wickedness of the heathen, that they were covenant breakers, Romans 1 verse 31, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable and merciful, as 'tis also one of the things by which he sets forth the horrid wickedness of the last days, 2 Timothy 3, at the beginning, This know also, that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers. But such is the reflection that is cast on God by a backsliding covenant people. Their practice has that appearance and language with it, namely, that they have found God a truce breaker or covenant breaker, one whose word, whose promise and oath is but little worth. And then the reflection we cast upon God appears to be the more vile, if it be considered what mean things they are that we depart from God. We go far from God to go after that which is vanity. We leave him for that which cannot profit, as much as to say that we have found that evil in God that has made us have so mean a conceit of him, that we esteem the very dust of the earth before him. For by forsaking God to pursue after the world, men set God in the lowest place, and set their worldly enjoyments above him. Second, let it be considered what ungrateful treatment of God this is for the great mercies God bestowed upon us in the late remarkable season. We all acknowledge that a pouring out of the Spirit of God upon us is the greatest mercy that we can receive. That 'tis much greater than if there should descend upon us a shower of gold and jewels. If God has showered us down so great a blessing on us, certainly 'tis no good requital of God for such mercy for us to carry towards God, as if we esteemed him false and treacherous. God has done us a great honour by what he has done for us. He has distinguished us, a people especially favoured of the Lord. The fame of what he hath done for us have reached far and wide, and we are looked upon by God's people at a great distance as unhappy people. And they are ready to say of us, as Deuteronomy 33:29, Happy art thou who is like unto thee, O people saved by the Lord, the shield of thy help, and who is the sword of thy excellency. And how ill do we requite the Lord for this honour he has put upon us to cast a reflection upon him. There are great numbers amongst us that hope that in the late season of God's wonderful blessing they received infinite mercy of God, that God at that time delivered them from eternal burning, made them his children, and gave them a title to everlasting glory in heaven. And shall we thus requite the Lord for it? Certainly it should be what we should blush at the thought of. Third, let it be considered that our reflecting upon God as though we had found iniquity in him is without a cause. We have no cause to charge God with any unfaithfulness towards us. What iniquity have we found in God? What is there in any of God's dispensations towards us that we have any reason to find fault with, as though he had not been true to his covenant? While we cleaved to God and religion was lively amongst us, God made good his promise, as he had made to those that seek first the kingdom of God in his righteousness. He prospered his people in all the labour of their hands, and blessed us with the most remarkable and universal health that has been known for many years. And since we began to decline and to depart from God, God has not dealt with us as our backslidings have deserved, but has been distinguishedly gracious in many respects. What a wonder did God work for us the last year, when part of the meeting house fell, and such multitudes were eminently exposed, that not one life has been lost. Though many were wounded, yet the wounds of not one of them, even to this day, have proved mortal. And when so great a part of the land has been so sorely visited with an unusual and very moral distemper, and many other towns have been filled with occasion of mourning, and some towns near us have been awfully visited, that we have been so remarkably distinguished by God's preservation, as though God had made a hedge about us. And in other respects has God smiled upon us, which your thoughts may suggest unto you, as the town is at this day in several respects. And though we have met with frowns, yet God has corrected us very gently, considering our deservings, and notwithstanding all our ill treatment of him, has gone on to bestow great mercies upon us. Therefore what have we to charge God with? Wherein has God dealt ill by us, that we treat him so ill, and do cast such a reflection upon him? Fourth, let it be considered that our thus casting such a reflection upon God is the way to bring shame and disgrace on ourselves. We are as a city set on a hill. We have made an high profession of religion, and the eyes of the world are upon us to observe. And if we lose what seemed to gain, and depart from what we made an appearance of, and at last prove no better than others, it will be the more abundantly to our reproach. Any ill qualities that are seen in any person or people is looked upon by the world so much the more to their shame, according as their professions and pretences of the contrary were higher. He that possesses extraordinary wisdom will be so much the more despised, if folly be found in him instead of wisdom. So that he that professes eminent religion will be had in so much the greater contempt for it, if they carry themselves wickedly. As Solomon says, 'tis with a person as dead flies cause the ointment of the apothecary to send forth a stinking savour. So it is with people that have heretofore been had in reputation for wisdom and honour. Ecclesiastes 10 verse 1. So that our backsliding is not only aggravated sin against God, but 'tis exceeding folly towards ourselves. By dishonouring God we disgrace ourselves and expose ourselves to contempt. Let these things move us to bethink ourselves and reflect on ourselves, and don't let us go on to reflect on God. If we continue still in our departures from God, we shall justify ourselves in it. The language of it will be that 'tis very true we have found iniquity in God, and therefore won't condemn ourselves nor alter our hand. But how greatly may God justly be provoked by such obstinacy in that which is so reproachful to him, in a people that has been so distinguished by his favours.